Hello and welcome to the Over and Back Classic NBA podcast. I am Jason, and with me as usual is Rich. Hello, Rich.
Hey, how's it going, Jason?
Pretty good. Got some interesting things happening in the NBA. It is just had media day, and there have been trades. There have been shenanigans. There have been lots of protesting and lots of people upset at the president. And surprisingly enough, I can't imagine why anyone would be upset with the president.
Why? It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
I cannot respect the post of the president of the United States. I mean, come on.
That
honorable place.
Yeah, honorable. Absolutely. So, in the midst of all that, almost anticlimactic, although it was obviously big news, Carmelo Anthony is going to Oklahoma City to join Russell Westbrook, who of course has been there, and Paul George, who is a newcomer there, was traded around draft time, I guess slightly after draft time. So yeah, that is a very interesting threesome, and it reminded me and you slightly at least of the way that the Boston's big three 10 years ago, Kevin Garnett, Ray Allen joined Paul Pierce to form, a very powerful trio. And circumstances are very different in terms, I think, of the expectations, in terms of there's some similarity, I think, in the stages of careers that they were. We'll talk about that. But I do think that there's enough parallels there that there's some interesting things to talk about. We got to talk about the differences between them. But so I think it's a worthwhile discussion.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, from the the baseline or kind of the surface level, it's of course one incumbent player, and the Boston's case was Paul Pierce, and in Oklahoma City's case, of course, Russell Westbrook, and then two other guys coming via trade or via in terms of Paul George and Carmelo Anthony. And as far as the careers, when you actually compare and contrast where all these guys have sort of been in their career, it is very interesting that there are a lot of parallels, and a little bit more parallels even than the Miami Big Three, which we're going to talk about the Miami Big Three here in a little bit, but I think they're a little bit different than this Big Three for a few reasons. But yeah, no, you can definitely see some similarities there. In one case, it's Oklahoma City who obviously, went through the era where they had Kevin Durant and were competitors in the West. And Boston, by the time this happened, this is 2007, 2008, when the Big Three comes together, they had sort of not really been in the mix there for a few years. But there was a time in the early 2000s, we've talked about it on the show a lot, where they were like a legit contender. The East wasn't as deep as it would become, in later years, but it was still a relatively competitive conference. And they were right there when Antoine Walker was at the peak of his powers, when Paul Pierce was arguably entering his peak or about where his peak was. They were a competitive team. They were making runs in the playoffs. They just never could quite get over the hump, and then they sort of had a lull period. Kind of similarly as well, Paul Pierce, there was some rumblings of, hey, is he even going to stay here? Is Boston better off sort of trading him or moving on? Is he going to demand a trade? Is he going to want out because he's been here in Boston for a while and they haven't really had success and he's not really all that much? And in Russell's case, he's beloved in OKC, and in Pierce's case, I don't know at that time that he was quite beloved, but still, there's some decent parallels there between what had sort of been going on with the two franchises. And then, of course, like you're saying, the expectations of, okay, now these teams are formed, now what do people think about them? And I think that's where we're going to get our real big difference, because then it was very different than it is, I think, today, in the midst, or, just after this Carmelo Anthony trade, where it's like, and I'm not sure your exact thoughts on it, but I'm like, that's pretty cool. They'll, be fun this year, but, we're going to talk about Boston, where it wasn't that. It was like, oh, here we go. This is ready to get off and running. And as we knew, it obviously did.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was certainly the expectation that the Celtics were now the favorites in the East. I don't know if it was. I mean, I do think that they exceeded expectations by how quickly it all came together, and the fact that they were by a lot of measures a really, really historically great team. They were competing with a pretty tough Cleveland team. Obviously LeBron was there. They were still kind of getting the roster around him, but they had just gone to the finals the year before. Weren't a great regular season team yet, but we're formidable anyway. Obviously the Pistons were in the midst of their Eastern Conference Finals runs that was coming to an end pretty soon after that. But they were expected to be at the top of that mix, but I don't necessarily think it was. I think they certainly were. It gelled together because I think they had some of the same concerns as I might have with Oklahoma City, where You've got three really good players, three players that complement each other possibly pretty well. There might be a little bit of overlap here. It is a younger trio. Westbrook is only 28. George is only 27. Carmelo is 33, so he's older. But if you look at Allen, who's 32, Pierce, who was 30, and Garnett is 31, the timelines are a little bit different. But I do think that... Yeah, I don't know how good the Thunder exactly are going to be. Like, I think they could definitely be the second best team in the West. I don't think they're any better than that. They would. I would say they're close to even with Houston and the Spurs right now in the West. I think they're kind of all like sort of in that same group. I don't know. How are you feeling about that?
Yeah, that's about where I'd place them as well. I mean, the problem is you have the giant juggernaut of the Warriors, where it's like it's almost tough to tell any team that And there was a number of teams this offseason, which by the way I love. This has been like my favorite offseason in quite a while because when you would think that because you have this dynamo of the Warriors, that everybody would just go like, forget it, they're winning, whatever, who cares? But for some reason, everybody went to the Western Conference to battle them, and then everybody like I love this offseason, and every team was like, you know what? No, we're not just going to sit down and let them win. We're going for it, and that's awesome. Like, and I admire what OKC did here, and we're going to talk a little bit about how the Boston thing was. When those three came together, Allen, Pierce, and Garnett, it was a long-term thing of this is our core for, X amount of years or whatever. Whereas this OKC thing, I mean, you have Westbrook who has not signed his extension. You have George who's done after this year. And then you have Carmelo who I believe has either 1 year or another opt-out. But either way, it's a short. I mean, this is let's see what happens this year and then who knows what's going to happen, next season. Whereas it was kind of interesting there with the Boston where it was like, Garnett signed an extension. We'll get into more details here in a little bit. But it was basically on that night, they locked those guys in and said, okay, you are the new Boston Celtics for the next half decade or whatever. And that it was pretty interesting how that sort of contrasts to what we have with OKC, where it's like kind of a gunslinger, let's see what the hell happens this year type mentality. But I like that. I like the idea that this offseason has been a lot of that, and particularly in OKC's standpoint of like, hey, look, Westbrook could leave in the offseason regardless of what we do, so why don't we just go for it and see what the hell happens this year, which is kind of cool. And maybe this is a way to sort of say, hey, look, this is what we're willing to do to keep you here, and this is what we're willing to do to do stuff. And also when you look at the guys that they gave up is fairly interesting as well. I think the trade markets were a little bit different for Allen and Garnett, and I think that ultimately what went wasn't that big of a deal, but I feel like Boston gave up a little bit more in those days than Indiana or the Knicks gave up, or the Knicks, acquired from OKC. They didn't really acquire anything at all. But
yeah. I mean, OKC gave up. They gave up Oladipo. Obviously, they gave up Sabonis, and then they gave up, McDermott and a decent second round draft pick. Mm-hmm. But not they were both surprisingly low returns, especially the return for Paul George, I think. Yeah, and the trade for Garnett, was Al Jefferson, who was regarded as like, could be a foundational young player, and then, a bunch of guys who had been, the Celtics had drafted a bunch of young guys, and, it was like Marcus Banks, who seemed like he might be okay at the time. It ended up not being a very good value deal, but I think it looked a little better at the time than it ended up, being. And obviously, like, people knew Garnett was really great, but there were questions around like Garnett. Well, all three guys to a certain extent. I mean, none of them had really accomplished that much in the playoffs. Pierce had been there with Walker at the conference finals one time, but they had struggled for about 4 years. Really, they'd been really bad the year before. And there were some questions about, is Pierce really into what we're doing here? And it just, there was definitely some discontent among the fans. I mean, he was still well liked, but there was definitely a segment of like, maybe he's, it wasn't quite like the Vince Carter and Toronto situation, but there was definitely a little fan discontent going on there. Ray Allen had some success with the Bucks and some success with the Sonics, but was at a point where had been like, a number one option. It was kind of clear that you couldn't win too much as the number one option with him, especially at 32. And Garnett, for the first 10 years of his playoffs, his career didn't get past the first round of the playoffs. Finally got past in 04, got to the conference finals, and for the first time actually had solid teammates with Sprewell and Cassell, even though those guys obviously weren't superstars. So yeah, I mean, you are at in somewhat of a similar term. I mean, it's been like 4 years since Anthony has been to the playoffs. Indiana's struggled for the last couple years. Obviously, they had a couple of conference finals appearances back when they were battling the Heat and gave them some pretty good playoff series. But ever since George broke his leg, obviously that changed the kind of the course for the franchise in his career. And he's come back. He's still really been really good. And then Westbrook, obviously Oklahoma City really had a lot of success with Durant and Ibaka and Harden. But Westbrook, last year, I think he carried them more than anyone could have ever expected them to go. His incredible play during crunch time, obviously, those huge numbers and triple-double and getting the MVP and all that, and I think certainly deserved it. But he has not spent much time in his career without Durant, but in terms of he has proven that he can carry team basketball season. So now it's three guys who I think who have something to prove in somewhat of the same way that those Celtics guys had as well.
Yeah, so here's a quick little kind of tail of the tape for all the guys so we can kind of check in at where the Celtics were at this point when they came together and where, OKC is now at this point. You had Ray Allen, as you mentioned a little bit earlier. He's 32 years old at this time. He had been a 7-time NBA All-Star, one-time All-NBA second team, one-time All-NBA third team. He had one top 10 MVP finish and one conference finals appearance, of course, with the Bucks, as you mentioned. You have Paul Pierce, who the accolades aren't as much, but he's only 30 years old at this point. He's been a 5-time NBA All-Star, 2-time All-NBA third team, and then one conference finals appearance with, of course, Antoine Walker and the Boston Celtics. Then you have Kevin Garnett, who is, obviously the most accomplished of the three. 31 years old at this point, 10-time NBA All-Star, 2-time All-NBA third team, 3-time All-NBA second team, and 3-time All-NBA first team. He was also 6-time All-NBA defensive first team. He had won one MVP award at this point. He had a 6 top 10 MVP finishes. But of course, the big thing on him was only the one conference finals appearance. So despite all those accolades, tough time getting out of the first round, and only that one time they really get to the conference finals. So that's kind of the Celtics coming together. And then Westbrook and the Thunder, rather. You have Russell Westbrook, who's 28 years old. He's a 6-time NBA All-Star, a 4-time All-NBA second team, 2-time All-NBA first team, one MVP, a 4-time top 10 MVP finishes, 3 conference finals appearances, but of course, obviously with his running mate Durant, and one NBA finals appearance pretty early in the tenure of Durant, and of course they still had Harden at that point as well. And then you have Paul George, 27 years old, so he's the youngest guy of this entire crop of people that we're talking about, all 6 guys. 4-time NBA All-Star. He won a Most Improved Player award. 3-time All-NBA third team, 1 top 10 MVP finish. But he made 2 conference finals appearances with the Indiana team, giving Miami a lot of trouble too, and almost upset them one of those years as well. And last but not least, you have Carmelo Anthony, who surprisingly is the oldest of all the 6 guys. I for whatever reason always think of Paul Pierce always had like an older game, because like even when he was 30, I kind of thought he was 36. Like, even when he was 27, he played like a 37-year-old, so it's kind of always been, that Paul Pierce was only 30 when the big three came together. But Carmelo's 33 at this point, 10-time NBA All-Star, 4-time All-NBA third team, 2-time All-NBA second team, 2 top 10 MVP finishes, and only one conference finals appearance for Carmelo Anthony. So what do you kind of think of those two when you look at the tail of the tape to compare and contrast to those two and or those two units and where they were at this point? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's really hard to. Obviously, this is kind of what we do on this podcast, but it is a little bit hard to go back to like what we thought of the big three in Boston before they accomplished what they accomplished. Because like as a unit, like I can think of them individually because I can understand them, but just thinking of like, okay, how is this going to fit together? How is this going to gel together? Obviously, like Garnett was this like tremendous revolutionary defensive force. And Allen, fit really well together with that shooting. And what we didn't know at the time, obviously, was Tom Thibodeau being the assistant coach and having that, being this defensive genius and being able to like basically revolutionize defense in the NBA through Garnett and through the scheme that they would be able to figure out kind of the rest of the league and be able to beat LeBron at his best and beat the Magic when they were really tough and things like that, and obviously win that championship against the Lakers and come close a second time. So thinking about where the unit, like I do feel like, I mean, obviously it's nice that the Thunder guys are, obviously Carmelo's older, but George and Westbrook are younger. You can really see, Carmelo being kind of a guy who can, like, an offense, I feel like I can see this working pretty well. Like, I can see, like, Carmelo being, like, a guy who, like, offensively spaces the floor. I think, Westbrook and George, like, in the pick and roll. And, like, I feel like they don't, like, get each other's way on offense too much. Like, I'm not sure that's, like, a perfect complement, but there's so much offensive talent, and it's not like they're totally going to be stepping on each other. Like, and I feel like the complementary guys around them, I think the Thunder, they don't have a lot of depth, but the guys that they actually do have, like, Roberson and Adams are fairly, like, they're not going to get too much in the way. It would be nice if they had, like, another guy who could, like, space the floor a little bit.
Yeah, Roberson is going to do all he can to get out of the way, which is like, there were times last year where Westbrook would pass it to him and he was like, no, give it to somebody else, please, not me.
The one thing, I mean, if he can be a guy, and I think he's shown this some, if he can be a guy who just kind of, like, cuts to the basket and you just get really easy offense out there, like, I feel like that can be kind of thing. And the thing about Boston's big three is that, like, the guys who they ended up getting to compliment them, they weren't really experienced. They didn't seem like they were necessarily ready for the moment. I mean, Rondo was, like, in his, it was only a second year at that point, and Perkins was really young too. And the fact that those guys actually stepped up and, just kind of really how well they ended up fitting and how they kind of came, I think that was the big surprise, even more than the big three being able to play together.
Yeah, well, what was interesting is they really loaded up on veterans at that Boston team. Like, you got guys like James Posey at that point was still relatively young, but they bring him in, they bring Eddie House, Tony Allen, who these guys are still kind of emerging, but the real big veterans they brought in were like guys like a PJ Brown, a Sam Cassell, a Scott Pollard, the guys like that, and those guys ended up really much not doing anything for that team and just kind of being there along for the ride, and that was a testament to guys like a Perkins stepping up, and Cassell wasn't needed because Rondo became great and stepped up, and PJ Brown wasn't needed because Perkins stepped up and was great, and Scott Pollard wasn't needed because. So it's pretty interesting that respect that, like, you have a lot of these younger guys and you go, okay, well, let's add some veterans and see how it works, but it's like everybody coalesced perfectly, and that made their team one of the best defenses of all time. I know they were far and away the best defensive team that season and one of the best defensive teams of all time. And that coalesced probably better than they would have ever expected. Obviously Garnett, was well regarded for his defense, making all those all NBA defensive first teams. But for Allen and Pierce to both step up, for Rondo to kind of assume that position, and then for Perkins, like, that was probably not in the mix that, hey, our two young guys, or, two of our, budgeting young guys are going to also be great. And then we're going to have like five really good guys. And that's going to be the issue with OKC, I think, in a lot of ways is where do Roberson fit in? Where do Adams fit in? I think they fit in well with that starting lineup, which is nice, but you do wonder where you're going to get those bench guys, because that's what Boston had, a lot of those guys, like your James Posey's, your Leon Pose, I mentioned Eddie House, Tony Allen, those sort of guys who were able to step up off the bench. I don't know if OKC necessarily has that same sort of depth that they had, but you never know. I mean, it could be a thing where Roberson finds his ideal spot of like, hey, cool, now you don't need to rely on me for any offense. I can just be one of the best defensive players in the league, and Adams as well can just say, hey, cool, good, I don't have to really be involved with the offense. I'll just play some solid defense and get some good offensive rebounds and stuff. So it could work better than we even think, because this Boston thing was an example of that, where it worked much better than I think a lot of people thought.
Yeah, and obviously I think Doc Rivers, the way that he was able to kind of bring them together, obviously KG's intensity and just like overwhelming like ability to just coalesce his teammates and to just kind of provide that like in your face leadership. It's going to be interesting if the Thunder can. Because I think there was some disaster potential with Boston with those personalities coming together. Like it kind of it got a little bit weird later with obviously the stuff with Rondo and Ray Allen, of them not getting along, and the way that Allen ended up leaving for Miami and the tensions there, and those guys definitely, like, there was some very strong personalities, and you never know how that's going to work, whether they're going to coalesce or clash, or a little bit of obviously there's ups and downs in a lot of those relationships, but. It's like I feel like Russell's really intent on the court. I don't know, like, off the court, like if he's like necessarily going to, like who's the immediate guy who's going to like kind of like step up the leadership there? Because I don't know if George has always been that guy. Like Indiana's had some weird like chemistry issues from time to time, and and Carmelo's usually been like. The teams that have sort of been the strongest that he's played on usually have had like other guys who were veterans, who were more like, that the year that the Knicks were really good with like Rasheed Wallace and Jason Kidd and those guys kind of being in there, and right. Carmelo obviously being like the central focus of like playing, but not necessarily having like being the vet there. And maybe Carmelo's he's older now and has embraced some like more responsibility off the court. So maybe that's going to, be there, in terms of, on the team. That really is going to be interesting. And then that's obviously, pretty unknowable here. But I do think, like I said, I don't see them as necessarily like it's hard for me to imagine them being like a transcendent team. They're going to just be a step below the Warriors. I would be shocked, if they were able to be as good as the Celtics were in '08. But, like as far as like, just getting something together and taking your shot, like this is a pretty good, this is a pretty good, considering what they had to get these guys to take your shot for 1 year. This is like this isn't a bad way of doing that.
No, and you talk about expectations. You talk about the idea that if they can compete with the Warriors or whatever. This is pretty interesting from Mark Stein. This is at at the time, of course, when the Celtics trade went down. He was at ESPN.com. There's the exact quote from the article. He says, "As expensive as it would be to employ a trio of all-stars, especially with Garnett eligible for a 4-year extension from his new team worth an estimated $116 million, Celtics management has made the commitment to stray into luxury tax territory for the opportunity to team Garnett with Allen and franchise mainstay Paul Pierce in an Eastern Conference for the taking. The Celtics would be expected to contend for an NBA Finals berth right away if the trade goes through, no matter what they put around that trio, especially after Cleveland advanced to the Finals in June without even a clear-cut second star to LeBron James." So, and then this, this is a little tidbit from that article that I kind of forgot that this was a thing, and then after I saw that, I kind of looked it up. I was like, oh yeah, I do kind of remember this being a thing. It says ESPN.com reported in June that Garnett would be hoping for a trade to the Phoenix Suns if he had to leave the team. The team, of course, being the Minnesota Timberwolves. His reasons, according to sources, Garnett would prefer to play in a warm weather city on a team with a championship potential if he's forced to relocate. Another big factor, Garnett and Steve Nash have become good friends over the past few years, starting in 2005 when Garnett was one of the first players in the league to call Nash and congratulate him on his first MVP trophy. And that's kind of an interesting thing there, because if you go through that article as well, you do realize a little bit of the background that Garnett really didn't want to go to Boston. He didn't really want to leave Minnesota necessarily. There was a lot of wrangling to get him to do it. They had agreed to a deal, I think a few days prior, and Garnett said, no, I'm not waiving my own trade clause. And then you just needed people to get talking. And then I think that, Allen coming over, then he was like, all right, cool, maybe this is something we got going here in Boston. But it is pretty interesting knowing, just how his Boston career went and how, synonymous he was with the Celtics, that there was reservations about going there, and there was reservations about leaving, Minnesota in general. Like, he kind of, in a lot of ways, at the time, seemed like he wanted to be there, or like you see from that quote, wanted to be in Phoenix. And for him to embrace the Celtics and embrace going to the Celtics, ended up turning around his career and turning around his legacy in a lot of ways.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. I hadn't thought about it's obviously a very direct connection between, the Allen trade for the pick that became Jeff Green, and that kicked off the rebuild in Seattle that led to them, of course, drafting Durant and then eventually Westbrook and moving to Oklahoma City, and then building the team that that now the Thunder are trying to rebuild around. So nice little circle here.
Yeah, and trading Jeff Green later for Kendrick Perkins too. So nice
right. There you go. Exactly. Yes, it all comes around in a full circle, but. Yeah,
it all revolves around Kendrick Perkins. Let's be honest. Yeah. We can do. I think our new show should just be. We should have a show where it's just 6 degrees of Kendrick Perkins and see how far we can go back. But,
it's good. Yeah, we'll be one of our sub shows though. Our sub series. WrestleMania, 6 degrees of Kendrick Perkins.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that one's going to do just as well, if not better than anything we've ever done. So
absolutely.
Because who's everybody wants Kendrick Perkins content. Let's be honest. You're always vying for that hot SEO of Kendrick Perkins in your search title. So.
Sweet SEO, yes. And obviously the difference in expectations is in '07. There's no power team like the Golden State Warriors. There's really almost never been a team that like that. That was that much of a favorite in the league. Other than the Bulls and the Jordan Bulls and maybe a handful of other teams in NBA history. So. So there was an opening there, especially in the Eastern Conference, as you talked about that Cleveland team was relatively weak. Detroit had been a powerhouse, but were starting to show some signs of faltering, and Boston definitely had an opening there, and on the other conference, the Lakers were about to emerge as a team that would go to 3 straight finals and win 2 championships there as Boston's rivals. So there was very much kind of a changing of the power guard in the league. The Spurs, who had been the champions in 03 and 05 and 07, we're going to have it was still going to be really good, but we're going to have a gap in really being a deep championship team. And the conference imbalance, which had kind of like leaned toward the West for most of the decade, and Garnett moving to the East, and I guess Allen moving to the East had a decently sized part in this. Made the East a stronger, conference than it had been for quite a while, and it's certainly a stronger conference than it is now. The exact opposite, of course, has happened this summer, when in fact the East has already, kind of been weak for the past, 5-6 years or so. Really, most of the 2000s, other than maybe a couple years, but
yeah,
really
a few little blips. The Miami years,
when this happened, and then a few years afterward, basically.
Yeah, exactly. So I remember that there was a Slate article that has 6 degrees, or it's like degrees of separation between players. Do you want to see Kendrick Perkins to George Mikan?
Oh, sure. There we go.
All right. So we got Kendrick Perkins, who played on the 2010-11 Oklahoma City Thunder with Nazir Mohammed, who played on the 1998-1999 Philadelphia 76ers with Rick Mahorn, who played on the 1980-81 Washington Bullets with Wes Unseld, who played on the 1968, thank God for Wes Unseld, he covers like 2 decades there. Wes Unseld, who played on the 1968-69 Baltimore Bullets with Bob Ferry, who played on the 59-60 St. Louis Hawks with Slater Martin, who played on the 50-51 Minneapolis Lakers with George Mikan. So there you go.
There you go.
Kendrick Perkins. So I dare you to find somebody that you cannot connect to Kendrick Perkins in 6.
All right, we'll have to. I can't just do that off the top of my head, but we'll.
That'll be our other show. It'll just be you saying names and then me doing this thing and then reading them off. It's gonna be perfect. It's gonna be great. Right. People are gonna love it. So
very good, very good. Yeah. So you mentioned Miami and how kind of the similarities between and differences between how Miami was built versus OKC. What do you kind of think about that?
Well, I mean, obviously from the surface level, again, you have one incumbent guy in terms of Westbrook, Pierce, and then Wade for Miami, and 2 stars coming over via trade, via free agency / trade. I think there was I think wasn't it officially like a sign and trade for LeBron and Bosh, but without I forgot what it was exactly, but I remember
it was officially a sign and trade, yes,
yeah,
but it
to get the most money and stuff like that. So essentially trade, right. But trade / free agency or whatever. But the level of stars, I think, is kind of the big difference here. But it depends though how you viewed Kevin Garnett at this point, because at that point, was he at or near the level that LeBron James was? Going into that final Cleveland year. That's what's kind of interesting to me, because now if you sort of ask me and I think about it, I go, oh, no, LeBron's way better. But you got to remember, LeBron was kind of had the same stuff that Garnett had. It's like, yeah, you're great, but, what are you doing in the playoffs? You're not really quite, taking this next step with your team. And, everybody that, the defenders were like, well, look at the team around him. It's no good. And he's doing all he can or whatever. And for both guys, it ended up being very true that, once you put good players around them, that their, their greatness shines through even more. But yeah, I guess it really depends on where you would put Garnett versus LeBron at this point, when that LeBron going to Miami and Garnett going to Boston, and where you sort of view them. Because if you do view them on the same level, then these are very similar. But if you view LeBron as like a complete conference swinging, game changing player at that point, then of course that is a bigger distinction than Garnett.
Yeah, I would view Garnett as like LeBron right now, where he's still really amazing, but he's not quite like at his peak.
Sure, right.
The level of fame is obviously different. LeBron is much younger, so it's a difficult comparison. I mean, I totally get what you're saying, and it totally makes sense in terms of kind of like, okay, he hasn't filled this expectation, that we've expected of him at that point. They both were dealing with that. I would say, yeah, Garnett is. Yeah, I mean, he was such a defensive force, and that was probably underappreciated, at that point. But I don't know. I mean, LeBron wasn't like at a point where, like, even though like Garnett certainly didn't have a lot of talent on his teams, but LeBron didn't have a whole lot of talent on those teams either. But they were winning 60 games a year, and Garnett's teams weren't even making the playoffs, for the last 2 or 3 years before he went to Boston. So it's a little different, but I definitely get what you're saying. Yeah, I mean, I do think that the natural, because LeBron and Wade, that was something where they were both very much used to. Playing kind of in similar areas of court in similar way, and there was a lot of trading off and one guy kind of standing, not doing much when the other guy was working. So it took a while for them to really get their chemistry going, and I feel like the natural fit, particularly if Boston, was already great. With Oklahoma City, I'm not quite as sure. I mean, I feel like maybe it's like I feel like Anthony and Westbrook and Anthony and George are totally fine because I think Carmelo's such a great catch and shoot guy. If he's willing to do that, which I think is another question because he's never really done that outside of the Olympics, which is a thing, but is also like the Olympics are a very specific context that isn't really replicated in the NBA. But how Westbrook and George actually kind of fit together, I think is going to be sort of interesting. Yeah,
it's definitely an interesting question there. But yeah, so Miami, I guess, similar in a sense, but I do think that like you're saying, and I agree with you as well, that LeBron at that point was such a big shift that none of those guys for Boston were on that level, and I don't think, of course, anybody on OKC is quite that level too, where it's like LeBron went to that team and it was like, okay, now the things have shifted enough. But like the Bosh comparison, like I would put, I don't know, the OKC guys, there's not a star at that top tier, LeBron level, but, two guys probably around that Bosh level, probably around the Wade Bosh level for sure. And, Wade was probably a little bit better at that point than Chris Bosh. So I think a little, guys at that sort of level, but nobody that was like that transcendent, oh my God guy like a LeBron who, immediately you put him on your team and that you're going to compete, for a title, you're going to be in the mix for a title as well. So that's a little bit how they're just slightly different, but I do think that's why, in the sense that we didn't necessarily put the Miami Big Three as the focus here and more the Celtics Big Three, because I think that just works a little bit better with this OKC one that we're talking about right now. One thing I want to talk about, we mentioned it a little bit as well, is the contracts and sort of the long term versus the short term of what's going on in OKC and what was going on, for the Boston Three. Everybody in Boston was locked up for a little while. I mean, Garnett, upon the trade, he agreed to a 3-year, $60 million extension. And that started after his prior deal ran out in 2009. So obviously he'd be there for quite a while after that. Allen, at the time of the trade, had 3 years remaining on his contract. And then Pierce had signed a contract extension the year prior, and that would keep him in Boston until the 2010-2011 season. You contrast that, of course, with, as we mentioned, with OKC, where, Westbrook has not signed his extension yet. Paul George is out after this year, and, there's rumblings that he's pretty much locked in to go to LA or whatever. He says that's not the case. Well, we'll see what happens. And then you have Carmelo, who, again, I forgot to look it up. I know Carmelo, he's either in the final year or he's got like a player option for the next year, right?
Yeah, he has a player option for the next year. So, yeah, he could opt out. I mean, there's a lot more money than he would probably get like on the market. So you could see him opting in. It's weird, a little bit weird because he might theoretically want to stay with Westbrook and George, but he has to make that decision before he would know whether they're going to stay. So,
yeah, right.
So it's hard to imagine him wanting to stay without them. So, so that's a little. It could be one of those things where he opts in and then they don't come back and then he gets bought out. Maybe kind of deals kind of like Wade just did with the Bulls. But yeah, I guess we'll see there.
Absolutely, and then I guess one of the final questions is, and we mentioned the potential for it to kind of blow up in a lot of ways of what is the chances that this is just an absolute abject failure and everything's a mess? And I guess at the time, did you think or do you know if there was any, popular narrative that this Boston thing was going to just completely collapse and fall? Like you mentioned, it did seem a little like there's always this issue whenever you have those big threes and whenever you have a collection of stars coming together, it's, how is there going to be enough balls to go around? These guys are used to being on, doing their own thing and doing all their own, and especially with Miami, we saw that for the first year. They're my big three where, LeBron and Wade weren't quite sure who should be doing what and who should be where, and Bosh wasn't quite sure where to fit in either. And we saw it with, the Cleveland Cavaliers with Kevin Love, who kind of seemed on the outside looking in and was like, I don't really know what you guys want me to do. Like, do I just stand in the corner? What do I do here? The Lakers, you mentioned as well, when you bring Odom and Gasol and Bryant, it was a little bit of a weirdness thing of like, okay, well, we're used to being the guy, who does what or whatever. Boston, I think, was a little bit more complimentary at the time, so I don't think there was necessarily as much of that because Ray Allen, everybody sort of assumed that his role was probably best just being kind of a catch and shoot guy. But Pierce and Garnett maybe had similar things, but they played on different parts of the court a little bit, which I think did help. And I think you can maybe make a case for OKC kind of being the same way. The big thing is is Russell Westbrook and Anthony going to be okay with, not having every possession? I feel like Paul George could probably be okay, being like sort of a hybrid point guard guy that takes the ball up and then sort of does some stuff. But I don't know. Are you worried at all about the potential for everybody getting upset that they don't get the ball enough or that there's not enough touches or do you feel like they're enough complimentary? Because I go both ways really on it.
Yeah, because Westbrook obviously he had a 41% usage rate last year.
Yeah,
which
it was the most ever.
Crazy. And you would think it might be hard to go back from that a little bit. And you these guys are all kind of used to trusting themselves and and they're used to certain play way, and there's comfort in that, and there's belief in yourself and that you're the best option, and I can't imagine they wouldn't want to make it work, but it just whether it's going to be harder to just get everyone kind of used to it and on the same page and figuring things out, and just I can see that they could do it. I think they have the skills to do it, obviously, and I think that I can see them fitting, but I think it's going to be. It's obviously going to take some compromise. It's really hard to say. I have to say, I was looking back at the role players, for the Celtics, and you mentioned a couple of them that kind of fit pretty well, but they actually do kind of match up pretty well. I can see Steven Adams and Kendrick Perkins. I can see James Posey and Patrick Patterson. I mean, Patterson's a little more big, but I kind of feel like that. I feel like Raymond Felton and Sam Cassell. I feel like Nick Collison and PJ Brown. I feel like all those guys. I see a little bit of the what the Thunder guys are doing. Alex Abrinas and Eddie House. I feel like I see some parallels with those guys. So that's kind of a sort of fun. It's maybe those guys have the raw elements that can make all that work.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting that they are a little, even before a lot of these deals were done, you saw them sort of acquire a few of the veteran guys or whatever. And there is a nice little contrast there of your stars and then your guys that your selfless role player guys. And I think that, again, we talk about the lineup as well with OKC and the the comparison, or rather, I would say in the Boston, between Roberson, a guy who, like Rondo, was really adverse to scoring. No, look, I'll do everything else. Don't give me I'll cut, I'll defend, I'll do all that sort of stuff. Rondo was not a guy who really wanted to score all that much. He was nope, I'm good. I'll just pass you guys the ball. And that's something that's awesome to see, that a guy can affect the game without touching the ball or without scoring. And that's going to be Roberson's role in a lot of ways. And then Adams as well, very similar to Perkins, can be that guy, the defensive force down the middle, a guy who's cool just getting offensive rebounds, who doesn't necessarily need, touches in the post, and a guy that you need to do stuff with or else he's going to sulk. I mean, he's a guy who's happy just being, role player, just running up and down the court and getting those hustle, steals, hustle blocks and hustle rebounds and stuff like that. So that's going to be really interesting to see. And I think they do have those two guys in the rest of the starting lineup fit perfectly with the other three. So that'll be interesting to see. I think that'll work out. It's just going to be the depth. But, when you bring it up with guys, you forget that OKC did kind of slowly or quietly load up with a lot of those kind of good veteran guys, like a Patterson and Raymond Felton, and those sort of guys really could fit in well. So yeah, it's the potential for it blowing up. I don't think it's going to be a gigantic, horrible failure, and it's just this is an entire mess and we need to get rid of this as soon as possible. I don't think it's going to be that. Whether, it's going to, like you said, put them immediately in the NBA Finals or immediately in the conference finals, I don't know, but I think that they've definitely put themselves in the picture, and I think they're at least a top 4 team in the West, if not higher than that, maybe top 3. So that's really kind of all you wanted to do. So no, I think the potential for it to blow up into this thing where Carmelo wants to get traded and everybody's sulking and everybody hates each other, I don't know that it's ever going to get to that level quite, and I don't know if these personalities really fit that either.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the only thing is that if Westbrook doesn't sign that extension, that's on one hand, it's going to be just kind of see how it goes anyway. This team is definitely, no one's under the impression that they're not there for 1 year to try it out and see how it goes. On the other hand, though, just the fear of Westbrook leaving after what happened with Durant, it obviously has to be on people's minds. There's going to be some anxiety in the air because of that. Whether that affects the team or not, obviously that's going to affect the fan base, I'm sure. So, but we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, I'm excited one way or another to see how it plays out. So, I don't think it's going to reach the highs of this Boston thing, but I think it's going to be a very fun little ride here for the next few months.
I agree. All right, well, thanks for checking us out. You can find us at the Stepback at fansided.com, where we do our podcast, and there's lots of good writing as the preseason ramps up. There's going to be a lot of good previews of all the teams and some great podcasts, some great articles, and so forth. So you should definitely check out the Step Back. You can find us on iTunes or Stitcher, wherever you listen to your podcast. Just search for Over and Back, and you can also find us on Twitter and Facebook at Over and Back NBA. And also, we have another project that we are working on. First episode is going to be coming out soon, and it is the Twitter account is NBA 20 years ago, and we are going to do a podcast series looking at the events of 20 years ago. So this is our first episode will be the off season of 1997, and then we'll be doing some episodes throughout the season, recounting key and important things. We've got a Charles Burwell choking scandal coming up. It is the last year of the Chicago Bulls dynasty with Michael Jordan, and lots of interesting things that are going to come up both on the Twitter account and on the show. So follow that and be on the lookout for those episodes. Anything else, Rich?
No, I think that's it. Yeah, I'm excited about that other projects, and I'm excited for you guys to hear it too. I think the Twitter account's been great so far, and I think the podcasts are you guys are really gonna be happy with them as well. So definitely follow that. Definitely check everything out we got going on there, and of course, everything that's going on at the Step Back as the season ramps up, and some more written content from you and I as well on the Step Back throughout the season. So definitely, I want to make sure you're following along there, subscribing, and seeing what we're gonna do, because it's gonna be some cool stuff coming up.
Yeah, we're excited about it. So, all right, thanks everyone for checking us out. We're back again soon.